Using her wits, 24-year-old Deborah Kiley fought off sharks for days after her boat capsized in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Welcome to Fanatics, where we're dedicated to bringing you the most unique and awe-inspiring true stories from history. Today, we will share with you the true story of Deborah Kiley, who survived for 5 days in shark-infested waters in a small life raft. Deborah Kiley was born on January 21, 1958 in Texas, to a family that had deep roots in sailing. From an early age, she took up the sport and became one of its most famous winners, completing her first Whitbread round, the world race, at just 25 years old. She had been hired to be part of a crew of 5 on a 58-foot sailing yacht called the Trashman. Deborah and her group set sail from Maine in what should have been a 6-day, 1,300-mile trip to Florida. The weather was beautiful, and the crew was in high spirits as they set off. The first part of the trip was uneventful. They stopped in Annapolis, Maryland, before leaving for the next leg of the voyage. Their idyllic journey quickly turned into a nightmare when they ran into a tropical storm. The waves were 30 to 50 feet high, and the wind was howling at 70 miles per hour. The boat's captain, John Lippoth, who had been drinking excessively, fell asleep at the helm, and the boat began to take on water. Deborah awoke in the dead of night, hearing panicked voices, and found icy seawater pouring into the cabin. The boat was capsizing off the coast of North Carolina. Mark Adams, one of the crewmates, tirelessly worked to inflate a small rubber dinghy life raft. Meg Mooney felt something slash her leg, and she started to bleed as she was trying to get into the life raft. The group managed to get into the life raft, but they were left stranded and at the mercy of the elements, and even worse, the sharks. Sharks were everywhere. The smell of Meg's blood instantly became an aphrodisiac that the sharks couldn't ignore. The group of survivors could see at least 20 sharks circling in the water, and some were bumping into the sides of the raft. The crew's condition rapidly declined as they continued to go without water. Minutes turned into hours and then days as the starving crew became severely dehydrated. Adding to that were Meg's seriously infected wounds. Blood, urine, salt water, and now pus was sloshing about on the floor of the dinghy. All the while, some of the crew became more and more delirious due to the lack of any hydration. By day 3, all of them were in a weakened state. Deborah and Brad Kavanaugh were the only ones who were still relatively strong. The others were weak and dehydrated, and it was clear that they would not survive much longer if they weren't rescued soon. John Lippoth and Mark Adams were drinking salt water, which accelerated their dehydration. The kidneys soon shut down to a lack of fluids in their body, but they didn't know that at first. Before long, John started to hallucinate. Perhaps because he had been excessively drinking prior to the disaster, he was more susceptible to dehydration. But thinking land was nearby, he jumped off the boat into deep waters with no lifeline attached to him. His fate had been sealed beforehand when his friends noticed how tired yet giddily happy for survival he seemed, even though all signs pointed otherwise. The sound of a scream pierced the air, blood-curdling and unbearable. With that, Captain John Lippoth was dead. Deborah recalls how instantly everything went silent after that. They all knew what had happened. The sharks. Nothing more needed to be said. With Mark also delusional and Meg weak from her blood poisoning, Brad and Deborah were the only ones left who were rational. They made a pledge to look out for each other. Deborah tried to cover herself with seaweed to stay warm. To stay mentally focused, she recited prayers she had learned as a little girl. Just after John died, Meg began hallucinating and mumbled about going to the convenience store for cigarettes. Despite Deborah's attempts at a reality check with Mark, he too plunged in headfirst toward the encircling sharks and his death. The ensuing shark frenzy nearly tipped over the raft, but somehow it stayed upright. And now there were only 3. That night, Meg's infection took hold, and she began having severe hallucinations. "We were sitting there watching her die," said Deborah. The next morning, Brad and Deborah awoke to a soulless Meg, dead the night before from her infection. And then there were 2. At first, Brad and Deborah were hesitant to throw Meg overboard. However, after some careful consideration, they decided to take her jewelry as a final gift for Meg's family and say a small prayer for her soul in honor of her life. Then, with heavy hearts and tears in their eyes, they let her body fall gently into the choppy waters below and watched as she sank further and further into the endless abyss. Brad and Deborah found themselves in a terrifying situation when he fell off the boat while trying to clean it. Brad struggled with all his might, but he couldn't get back into the boat. Deborah felt as if both of them were doomed because if those sharks came again, he'd be dead sure enough. However, just when all hope felt lost, suddenly an engine noise reached their ears. A Russian cargo ship. The two stranded friends looked up at its bow window light, becoming very close yet still far away. They waved desperately until finally the Russian sailors waved back. Summoning all of his strength due to the adrenaline of possible rescue, Brad managed to throw himself onto the dinghy. The moment the Russian sailors threw a life preserver, both Brad and Deborah jumped for it. A second delay would have been too long for these weary survivors. Deborah didn't let her ordeal stop her from achieving the goals that she had set for herself, from being a motivational speaker to becoming the author of Albatross, the true story of a woman's survival at sea. She died in 2012 at 54 years old due to unknown causes. The will to survive is a powerful motivator. It can drive people to do amazing things in the face of adversity. When so many people are lost, it is the will to survive that keeps them going. Deborah Kiley's story of survival is just one of many inspirations to remind us to keep going even when the odds are against us. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please help us to continue providing similar stories by liking and subscribing to our channel. Until next time.